Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're broadcasting to you on Channel 9. We're also broadcasting to you on WJOP-LP Newburyport FM 96.3. We're also live streaming on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel, and that's available at www.ncmhub.org. Well, I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted to welcome today's guest. Professor Monica Black is here to talk about her recent book about post-World War II Germany's supernatural eruptions during the late 40s and 50s. And at the end of today's show, Joel Grossman, who is chaplain at Constellation Hospice, will teach us what happened at a death cafe, one of which will be happening next Monday, March 1st. Well, let me begin by introducing you to Dr. Monica Black. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, where she teaches modern German and European history. A demon-haunted land, witches, wonder, and the ghosts of the past in post-World War II Germany appeared with Metropolitan Books in late 2020, and that's her second book. Her first book was Death in Berlin, from Weimar to Divided Germany. That was published in 2010 by Cambridge University Press. Monica is also the editor of the journal Central European History. Monica, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit us this morning and talk about this fascinating subject.
Oh, Mary, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor. Thank you.
It's totally my pleasure and my honor. I've been looking forward to talking to you for the last month since I was able to book you. So, well, your book, A Demon Haunted Land, and by the way, not for nothing, great title. It describes, as I mentioned, supernatural eruptions ranging from witch trials to messianic faith healers in response to Germans' silence about their participation in or complicity with genocide, war, and racial dictatorship during World War II. Nowhere else in Europe, as you quote Hannah Arendt saying when she returned to Germany in 1949, was the nightmare of the recent past felt less and less talked about than in Germany itself. And yet, as you say, and I love the way you put this, moving murkily in the near depths was the ever-present memory and fact of war. And just because nobody talks about atrocities doesn't mean that they won't create what Freud surely would have called the return of the repressed, a kind of a psychic churn that will create florid distortions that will reflect almost like a mirror, whatever the shape is of the moral void that's not being dealt with. And as true, as is clear in your book, for societies and historical periods as it is for individuals. So when I first read about your book in a journal here in Boston called the Boston Review, I was immediately fascinated because I was completely unaware of this chapter in post-World War II German history. Also because you talk about these phenomena in a way that connects these specific historical stories to larger psychic, spiritual, and moral narratives, to human needs that we all have to deal with corruption and moral toxins. And of course, because the demons that you described couldn't help but resonate with some of the current hauntings, the weird and turbulent social and political landscape that we're all witnessing in the United States right now. So let's dig in, Monica. The first thing I wanted to ask you to clarify was, to what degree did Germans avoid talking about the post-war revelations about the scale of the Holocaust and the absolute barbarity of the concentration camps? And in tandem with that, to what degree then did the former Nazis and those complicit with the Nazis remain embedded in everyday German society and institutions?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Mary, and a very good one to lead off with too, I think. One thing I would say to begin with is that the real scale of the crimes of the Third Reich were really not known until historians put all of that together, and that took decades. So we should, when we talk about silence and when we talk about what people knew, we have to come in knowing that what was known was very limited compared to what we know now, actually. But the more direct answer to your question is that in the immediate aftermath of the war, for the first few years, under the processes of what was called denazification, which is an Allied-led attempt to sort of purge the symbols of Nazism and the ideas of Nazism and the personnel who had staffed the various government agencies and education and the medical profession, there was an attempt to sort of purge these people and these ideas and these symbols out of the public sphere. There was also, the Nuremberg Trials took place, a series of trials. And in these trials, all kinds of revelations came to the front, or came to the forefront. People heard about the kinds of things that had happened, the kinds of medical experiments, just to give one example, that had taken place in some of the camps. So in the first years, I would say, under the processes of denazification and during the Nuremberg trials, the Holocaust and the crimes of the Third Reich were rather freely discussed. But around 1949, when the new West German state and then the East German state are founded, the post-war German states are founded, that conversation sort of closes up. And after that, people still discuss the Third Reich. There's never a perfect silence about these things by any means. But I would say that the way that they discuss them becomes very coded, and it becomes sort of ritualized. And it's not an open discussion by any means. It's a very careful one. And as you pointed out, it's also important to note that in many aspects of government, in intelligence services, security services, various institutions of government, but also the medical profession, education, former Nazis remained in places of authority and influence. So that's also an important thing to know about the period.
Yeah, well, that's interesting and fair and important to make about the slow, gradual kind of process of revealing things. And then it sounds like, if I'm understanding you, Monica, that after the East-West divide, then it wasn't that there wasn't a complete absence, but it was very coded and very careful. So that's really interesting and an important caveat to add to this discussion. That said, though, not talking about something horrific openly and in a way that honors the horror and the trauma that has been done to people, it's not the same. The silence isn't the same as lack of awareness at all kinds of levels, whether it's conscious or whether it's submerged and compartmentalized. So I was hoping that at this point you could please tell us more about how the failure to confront the whole of the Nazi past manifested in the demons that rose to the surface of the German psyche. And I was hoping you'd start by talking about the rise of the wonder doctors and miracle workers, because it's such a fascinating story. You mentioned colorful and charismatic figures that reminded me of Elmer Gantry. But there was one in particular I was fascinated by. I'm not sure I'll pronounce his name correctly, Bruno Gröning. He who had some tinfoil charms that he took about with him. So what kind of healing were people seeking from the wonder doctors, and did it help them? And if so, how?
Well, that's right. That's right. There was a kind of a small flood of these individuals after the war. One after another, actually. And the one who rose to the greatest fame and became the most influential and was the best known and is today even, there are websites about him in at least 12 languages, I think, maybe more. And he still has a large following all over the world. Though many people don't know his name. Bruno Gröning, you pronounced it perfectly. I wanted to commend you about that. But Bruno Gröning was a fascinating figure. He was from what had been the city of Danzig in Germany, which becomes a part of Poland after the Second World War. He, after a stint in the German army in the Wehrmacht, and then a period of time that he spent in a Soviet POW camp, he becomes a refugee. He leaves where he's living, and ends up in what becomes West Germany. And as far as I can tell, until about 1949, if he was known for being a healer, which he seems to have been, but he was only known to a sort of small circle. But this circle was large enough that a family heard about him and asked if he would please, got in touch with him and asked if he would please come and see their son, who was a little boy who was suffering from some kind of a muscular degenerative condition that had made him over time unable to walk. And for months and months, he had been in bed and not able to get up. Well, Bruno Gröning comes to the family's home, and within a short period of time after meeting with their child, the boy is able to get up and very hesitantly and very slowly start walking around. And the impact of this occurrence was just explosive. Suddenly, within just a few weeks, really, thousands of people were converging on the small town where they lived, which is called Hereford. It's in Westphalia. And people were coming and sometimes standing in the rain for days, just in the hopes of seeing the author of this amazing event, the author of this amazing cure. So Groening wasn't the only healer of the post-war era, as I point out, but he was far and away the most popular and influential. I mean, he became the subject of a series of experiments with doctors at a famous medical clinic at the University of Heidelberg. He became the subject of legislative committee hearings in the West German Parliament, the Bundestag. His gifts were extolled by important politicians of the day. A documentary film was made about him. He was on the cover of the national news magazine, Der Spiegel, and appeared in all kinds of other publications. I say in the book that people even tried to buy his bathwater because of its presumed salubriousness. So many people, you know, I was interested in him because he's just a fascinating character, but I was not so much in the book interested in him as I was in why he seems to have been successful. And he does seem to have been quite successful with a lot of people. So there are numerous testimonies of people saying they came to him with one or another problem and they went away feeling much better or even felt cured. And I wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand why he was so compelling to so many people in this moment of, as you point out earlier, of moral crisis, of true material. Yes, I mean, the country had been smashed by the war in all ways, but also a moment of moral collapse, right? And it was often said that Groening had his best successes, which I found very fascinating, treating people who had various forms of paralysis, but also people who had experienced sudden blindness and sudden deafness. And I asked myself, why? What was he treating? And why were these symptoms the ones that people were exhibiting? And why was he successful in treating them? And that was what I found so compelling about the story of Bruno Groening.
Yeah. And did you come up with hypothesis about why, I guess they could be considered psychosomatic symptoms since they came on suddenly and they were cured psychically? Did you have of course you have a hypothesis. This is your book, but please share it with us.
I did have a hypothesis. I mean, you know, early West Germany was an uncanny place in more ways than one, and not just because of wonder doctors. It was an uncanny place because it was a place of secrets. It was a place of fears. It was a place that fears of what had, you know, that what had been concealed might be revealed. And some people even referred to an incipient, you know, this is a country in which a series of amnesties were passed in the early history of West Germany to place many of the crimes of the Third Reich out of the law's reach. And this was done to both to clarify some legal matters, but it was also done for psychological purposes to sort of close the door on the past in a way, and to say, now we have to rebuild the country and move on. And this, as it turns out, was a successful strategy. That does seem to have been, you know, very instrumental in the rebuilding of the country. But it remained the case, as you said earlier, that people didn't forget what happened just because they closed the door on talking about it. And, you know, a lot of people talked about, or one of the most interesting metaphors that I found in the post-war period was this metaphor of latent civil war. The idea that beneath the surface of daily life, where people went about their business, they were secretly suspicious of each other, mistrustful. People knew that they had done bad things. They knew that other people had done bad things. They knew that they had had bad things done to them. And they also knew that these things couldn't really be openly discussed, and maybe they didn't want to openly discuss them. So all of those things made Bruno Groening's appearance and his fame very, very fascinating to me. You know, that question that I referred to earlier about what exactly was he curing? I mean, historically, human beings have often intertwined health and illness with the sacred and the sinful, with with ideas about punishment morality and suffering and all of those things. And I was fascinated by those themes in the Bruno Groening story.
Yeah.
And, you know, history can produce particular forms of illness, particular symptoms. I mean, shell shock in the First World War, PTSD has its origins in the Vietnam War. So I was interested in that. Why were people exhibiting forms of paralysis after the war? Was there some sense in which there was a sort of denial of volition in that kind of symptom? And these are not things that are easy for a historian to discuss. I have to read against the grain of the sources sometimes, as we like to say, to get to these things. But it's my opinion that a lot of people that Groening was treating were indeed suffering from the effects of war in one way or another, from the effects of guilt, from the effects of shame, etc. It's also not it's also important, I guess, to underline that when Groening arrives in this little town in Hereford, he came on the heels, as it happened, of a series of apocalyptic rumors that had been flooding the country. And these rumors were carried by word of mouth through rumor that the world would soon be covered in a planet smothering snow, that stars were going to collide and their bodies fall to earth and split the earth in half. I mean, these rumors had been building for weeks, and they were not just carried by word of mouth, they were also printed in newspapers, usually as jokes. So in other words, a newspaper, there would be an article saying, oh, somebody says tomorrow the world's going to end. But whatever the purpose of the newspaper in doing that once they're printed in newspapers, they're picked up again in word of mouth, and that it builds, right? So just on the heels of these waves of rumors. And by the way, the date for the end of time was supposed to be March 17, 1949. This was printed in numerous newspapers. This is the time that Bruno Groening shows up in Hereford. So there's this salvific quality that I argue that there's this salvific quality attached to his appearance, precisely because he comes at the tail end of what was supposed, because apocalypse means revealing. It doesn't have to mean something awful happens. We often associate with bad things, but apocalypse means unveiling. And what was unveiled was redemption, actually, was healing. So all of those things were very fascinating to me about the Groening case.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you describe it, it works beautifully, really, because you're talking about a conscious strategy of here we are, we're all living with people that might have been Nazis, or we know they were Nazis, but we're still a country and we have to continue living our lives. We need doctors, we need institutions, we need to keep going. And so that continued, leading to a kind of a careful talk, if any, about what had just happened. But it doesn't go away. Beneath the surface, then you have all these fears and all this repressed guilt and all this need for healing that then gets adopted by an unofficial, uninstitutionalized, but nonetheless powerful, magical, supernatural faith healer, who is clearly, it seems to me from what you're saying, meeting a psychic and a spiritual need that people have. So that's fascinating, Monica. It really is. Well, another feature of the demon haunted land were exorcisms and accusations of witchcraft, resulting in a series of trials. I think you say there were more than 70 of them in the 1950s, which is stunning to those of us who didn't know anything about this history, with trials for defamation, I guess, and even violence. So tell us more about that and how you understand at the depth psychology level what's going on with this phenomenon.
Yes. Oh, sure. Okay. So yes, I know it is amazing. And when I first started reading about it myself and then started doing the research, I too was just really puzzled, because I thought, what happened to me initially was that I found a book whose title in English would be something like, "Are There Witches Among Us?" And I thought, that's funny. I wonder what that was. And I was sitting in a library in Berlin, and I asked the librarians to please bring the book because I had to find out what it was about.
Yeah.
And it was about people's fears of witches. And I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. So, but then I started doing research about witchcraft. And of course, witchcraft, you're in Massachusetts, of course.
Yeah.
The most famous.
Salem. Yeah.
Not the only.
Yeah.
There are witchcraft cases in Tennessee and witchcraft cases in other parts of the United States. But of course, Salem is in the United States the very famous instance. But that's when we associate witchcraft trials with the early modern period, what European historians call the early modern period, the 16th and 17th centuries. That's the period in European history, at least, where the big witch hunts happen. Mm-hmm. And those are big clerically led, judicial trials where lots of people get swept up into, an accusation is lodged and lots of people get swept up into the energy around that. And those trials often ended in executions and burnings and other terrible things. And that's not what happened in the 1950s. I mean, I want to be very clear about that. When the press called the instances that called these trials witchcraft trials, because usually what happened in them was that someone had taken a neighbor to court for calling them a witch, for defaming them, but in other cases, they took people to court for more serious charges, for instances of violence, where people had done violence to someone because they said that person was a witch. Mm-hmm. So that's still pretty interesting.
Yes, it is.
It's not Salem, but it's pretty interesting. And so I started, that idea that witchcraft at its core is a kind of conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. The idea is that there is someone among us who is in league with the devil and is working behind the scenes through supernatural mechanisms, through magic, to do harm, right? And that idea endured over the centuries. In other words, the trials stopped, but these large-scale trials stopped, but people still accused each other of being witches. Mm-hmm. And this is a pan-European phenomenon. I mean, it persists. The last execution of a witch, I believe, in the German-speaking world happens in Switzerland in the late 18th century. But witch beliefs, fears that your neighbor might be in league with the devil, do not end. And they continue in many, many, many parts of Europe. Yeah. So the post-World War II accusations. Now, Mary, I can talk about this for a long time, so you have to interrupt me if I go on too long. But I'm just gonna stick your hand up or something.
Okay, it's so fascinating. The underlying conspiratorial frame of mind that is universal and transhistorical is what's really fascinating. So, and by the way, not to interrupt you, but it's just an interesting kind of note here that, currently there is an exhibit at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem where they have the original documents from the witch trials there. They have them on exhibit. I'm hoping to go within the next couple of weeks. And, and he talks about it's basically a conspiracy theory, the witch trials, and that they tend to happen during times of great social turmoil and great underlying fear and anxiety. Now, you probably have an underlying conspiratorial and anxiety-driven frame of reference to come up with the idea of witches, but it's also interesting to note in terms of what we're talking about things that erupt in response to silence or denial, that it took Salem 300 years to put up a memorial to the witches who had been killed in those trials, 300 years. So we're talking about this now. This happened in the 1950s. We're ahead of the game. So anyway, please continue about the kind of the drivers of this, Monica.
Yes, sure, of course. So, I think that a lot of anthropologists and historians, both who work on, comparative witchcraft, as you pointed out, would say that witch fears, which are indigenous throughout the world. I mean, this is not some phenomenon of certain parts of the world or certain places in time. It's a constant in human cultures, but it takes different forms in different places, and it can erupt in response to different things. But often, the people who study comparative witchcraft would say that that witchcraft accusations erupt in response to dramatic social change and unrest, and that witchcraft accusations are more likely to surface in moments of instability and insecurity and unease and mistrust, precisely the kind of moment that happens after the Second World War. And in Germany. And often what happens in an accusation, in the situation in which an accusation might emerge, I guess, is that someone has had a string of bad luck. So it doesn't happen because I break my ankle and then I say that someone bewitched me and that's why my ankle got broken. It's that I have a series of mishaps. One of my hogs die. These accusations, they didn't exclusively, but they often happened in small communities and in agricultural communities. So I have a hog die, one of my kids gets sick, and I break my ankle. And then there's a big storm and a tree falls on my house. Now I want to know what's going on, right? Yeah. And there were people, and again, here's where the wonder doctors, the healers, come into play. There were people who were known in communities to be able to do the kind of apotropaic rituals necessary to stop stuff from happening. So in one case, that for which there's extensive documentation, because there's not extensive documentation on a lot of these cases anymore. There are many mentions of them in various places, but this case has a huge cache of sources. I mean, boxes and boxes. And what happened in that case was that a man who was a healer, whose name was Waldemar Eberling, came to see a family about their child who was sick, and he was able to treat her. And then he told the family, actually not in words, but he gestured. He said, someone around here is up to no good, and you need to watch them. And out of this kind of oblique statement, a whole kind of community anxiety erupts about who's a witch, and some people get accused, and then some of the accused take Eberling to court to stop him from accusing them, which shows, I think, actually how significant the accusations are. In other words, why would you bother to take somebody to court for just calling you a name? It wasn't just a name, it was something socially meaningful to people to be called a witch. So what I see in all of this is so a string of misfortunes happen, and suddenly these misfortunes people begin to suspect that something's behind them, that there's a cause behind the cause, not just a proximate cause, a high wind caused a tree to fall on my house, but some more ultimate cause. There's somebody behind that thing making that happen, which is an approach that was first theorized, 100 years ago by a British anthropologist named Evans Pritchard. He had a really brilliant theory about witchcraft acting as a form of theodicy, actually, that it was a way that human beings in communities where the witchcraft idea was meaningful, it was a way of explaining otherwise inexplicable things. Why did that tree fall on my house? And by implication, not someone else's. So in my book, I thought a lot about the way that in 1933, when the Nazis took power, they handed out property and position and power to their friends. And the people who had position and authority lost it. And then after 1945, when the war ends, the people who had gotten property, gotten things, gotten sinecures, lost those things. And those people are living side by side with each other. And everybody knows that somebody did something, and and especially, and that's why I think it's important that these are small, often very small communities where these things erupted, where these cases erupted. In small face-to-face communities, everybody knows something about everybody else. And the kind of misgivings that those power shifts had given rise to were that for me was the most important context. There are other contexts that I could point to too, but that to me was the most important one, that some of the people in these towns after the war, I was talking earlier about denazification. Part of denazification involved small committees of locals who would look through the documents of their neighbors, right? They were appointed to investigate the local members of the community to see what they had done during the Nazi period, and what category they should be placed into under the denazification rules. And those people were people's neighbors. I mean, so people were judging their own neighbors. Nobody would have forgotten that. And all of that, so not just Nazism itself, but then the denazification process also just created this constant, as you put it earlier, and you're exactly right, this churn of anxiety, of misgivings. And that, in my opinion, is what gave rise to these or many of these cases at least.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I'm fascinated by what you say about the supernatural explanations after this misfortune, that misfortune, this misfortune, and what's up, because it may seem irrational, but it creates a coherent, anyway, narrative.
Right.
And we do need coherence.
Yes.
It may be hard to come by, but it's something that's hard to live without. So,
Yes.
well, you know, Monica, to hear these stories and what you're talking about, and of course, you know, my mind went, and I'm sure many, you know, people's minds immediately go to contemporary United States. And I would like to shift to that, if we might, because the growing popularity and influence of QAnon, for example, with this kind of Delphic babble, the oracular kind of babble about conspiracy theories that do focus on, interestingly, on child abuse and Satanism,
Mm-hmm.
and that postulate former President Trump as a messianic leader. And Trump, of course, famously in response to the pandemic, was hyping miraculous and profoundly unscientific cures for COVID. And most recently and tragically on January 6th, of course, we had people who thought they were on a holy crusade of sorts attack the Capitol in order to hunt down, and if they had succeeded, they surely would have assassinated elected officials in order to do in their minds what they thought was like 1776, they were saving the nation from oppressors. So, you know, and Monica, mainstream news sources and commentators, I find, talk about these phenomena as an example of hyper-partisanship. Or they shake their heads and talk about the cowardice of political leaders. But to me, that seems inadequate to what we're watching. So it seems to me that talking about a divided nation politically, right, left, a horizontal framework, seems insufficient. You need a kind of and I think you talk about it as a vertical framework between a perception of reality and a coherence that some of us find by looking at evidence, looking at science, but there is also a different narrative that creates a kind of I see it as, I think of it as a kind of a overlying visionary landscape, really, in which they create compelling legends, in which an ordinary citizen can become a revolutionary knight errant in search of a holy grail. And for them, it seems that installing Trump as a kind of a holy emperor becomes the goal. And in fact, apparently QAnon is now looking toward March 4th as the date when somehow Trump will miraculously be installed, I think not just as president, but as a kind of holy emperor. March 4th, by the way, they chose that date because before the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, that was the original date for the presidential inauguration in the United States. So, Monica, I've been dying to ask you. And now as my moment has come, what do you think these divisions that we're seeing, what do they make you think of in terms of, you know, what you learned about post-war Germany and a demon-haunted land, and perhaps about a deeper truth about what's happening in our culture?
I mean, I think your analysis is brilliant, Mary. Mine would be, I do. And I think, and mine is quite similar to yours. I mean, I agree with you that this kind of idea that I don't even think that hyperpartisanship comes close to being an explanation of things like this. And the fracturing of the GOP and that's not what's explained.
We're beyond that. We left that behind some time ago.
Yeah, we're in a different place now. That's exactly right. I think, you know, unfortunately, and a lot of people won't like this, but you have to try and understand the way the world looks from the point of view of some of these people. A lot of people won't like that because, you know, the QAnon phenomenon is has been said to be and is clearly has earmarks of being an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Yeah. But you know, studying Nazism and the history of the Third Reich, the social and cultural history of that period, you know, I've spent a lot of my career trying to understand really abhorrent ways of thinking, and I think that I think that it's important to one has to take seriously on some level what the world looks like from somebody else's point of view and try to understand it. Understanding does not mean have sympathy for it. It means try to figure out the logic of it. What is the logic of that for this particular population of people? Whatever that population is, by the way, because no one really knows. I mean, that's one of the most, fabulous, in the truest sense of the word, aspects of the QAnon phenomenon. Nobody knows who the Q person is. Nobody knows nobody knows the scope of it. I mean, obviously, if national level politicians are QAnon, I mean, now some of them, Green, disavows QAnon, I suppose, in some way, but clearly the phenomenon is big and it's growing. And every time Q seems to be wrong, they come up with a new
explanation.
Place,
right? They just fold it into, it just gets folded into the narrative.
Exactly. But I think that your point about narrative is exactly right. I think that we have to find ways of making sense of the world for ourselves. And what I want to take seriously, this is what I'm trying to say, what I want to take seriously is that for some significant part of the population, the ways of making sense of the world that make sense to us have stopped making sense for them. And that's what has to be understood. It's not about, again, it's understanding does not mean sympathizing with their viewpoint. It means understanding on some level why the world has stopped making sense for them and why they've invented another story about it to make it, to be able to narrate it, as you put it. I mean, to be able to tell a coherent story about reality. And I would also say this, for a lot of people, science and facts, people are constantly invoking facts now. Facts are not that compelling at a certain level, right? I mean, there are certain kinds of questions that cannot be answered with facts. Questions about why do I exist? Why is there evil in the world? Those kinds of questions, simply, science has no purchase on those questions. So I think it is indeed, as you put it, it's about trying to understand what kind of a moral landscape people are inhabiting, why they need to find enemies. What is this invocation of evil about? Why is the person who opposes you politically not only your political opponent, but evil? That's the part that has to be understood, I think.
The evil seems to justify the aggression. But what's also fascinating is the need for nobility.
Yes.
And I do agree with you. I think it's important and probably can't be stated too often that searching for understanding doesn't mean sympathizing, but how do you understand the distortions and where our culture has taken some of us or all of us so that you can correct for it. If you don't understand those two, then the need for an enemy and something to push against, and also beneath that, the need for something that feels like it is ennobling their lives, because that is what comes through very clearly, in the narratives about what happened on January 6th. Well, there was something else I wanted to ask you about in response to contemporary America and what might be going on with QAnon or other forms of magical thinking, because another big development in our country over the last year was, of course, an eruption of awareness about systemic racism, slavery, the 1619 Project, the murder on TV that we all saw, the horrific murder of George Floyd. And after that, then there seemed to be, of course, there were the Black Lives Matter protests, but there also was, suddenly the bestseller list was filled with books about racism and anti-racism and what systemic racism means. And so it entered the mainstream consciousness and the mainstream media in a way we haven't seen for a very, very long time. And I couldn't help but wonder about what that means for the psyche of the United States, because Germans had Nazis, we've had slaveholders and racists, we've had Jim Crow. It never went away. It's still with us. In fact, part of the January 6th phenomenon was, white supremacy. Of course, the 1619 Project was met pretty quickly by the 1776 Project, which was a kind of a magical history of the United States that purged it. It made me think about your book when I read about it, actually, because it was like a purge of slavery and racism. So I wonder what your thoughts are about whether the American supernaturalism and magical thinking we see arising today reflects what connection you think it might have with the moral void we have around never adequately dealing with our own racist past.
Yeah, it's a really huge and great question. I don't know if I'm up to the challenge of answering it, but I do think that one of the things that strikes me about the current moment is the amount of energy that people put into denying our history. I mean, that takes a lot of psychological energy.
It does.
To unearth the past takes energy, but to deny it so vigorously at every turn, and to defend oneself at every turn from any hint that one or the group to which one belongs might have responsibility, not only for past injustice, but for ongoing structural forms of injustice. I find that really striking.
It is striking. It started already, even with the January 6th insurrection, which is being distorted and some denied and kind of turned into something very different, even though we all saw it, with our very own eyes. So sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. I was just thinking about, Hannah Arendt had this, Hannah Arendt is a problematic figure in some ways, but in other ways, a brilliant theorist and a brilliant student of history. Even though she was trained differently from that, but an amazing historian in some ways. One of the things that she said about post-war Germany was this, she talked about the way that people chose alternate realities after the war. Germans chose, when she would have conversations with them, she said they would argue with her about the causes of the Second World War, and they would argue that somebody else had started the Second World War, that the Poles had started the Second World War. I mean, crazy things. And she said it was clear to her that people had just decided that they had chosen another reality because that reality helped them cope. The question is, I think what we have to ask ourselves as a society is, how do we get people to spend their psychic energy on something else besides defending themselves from, defending a fantasy version of history?
Well, you have just led me into the final question that I wanted to be able to ask you today, because I love, you have a definition. You say that a ghost is something or someone that's standing right in front of you and you're pretending you can't see it. And you've also said, though, that listening to ghosts allows us to hear the otherwise unspoken, and sublimated terror is at the center of social life. And so I wanted to ask you, and I know I haven't given you any easy questions today. So forgive me when I ask you, how and with whom do we begin to converse with ghosts? How do we find the courage, and who are our conversational partners in that endeavor?
Yes, I know, right? That's a tough question. I do think that, I mean, I know it will sound in some ways, I think historians can do some things, but I also think that our colleagues in the social sciences, anthropologists, sociologists, I'm always looking for clues that they're figuring this out. But I would also say that this can't be about academia. Academics can do some things, and they do some things very well, but I think that we have to reform our society. We have to develop some kind of energy towards doing that. And I mean all of us, because I think that, we have to confront the effects of extreme individualism, of hyper competition in every area of life, from kindergarten on. We have to confront the greed, the acceptance of violence. We have to confront the effects of poverty and the structures that intentionally keep some citizens from thriving. And we have to confront the fact that how do we accept the fact that some children go to schools that aren't fully funded and other children go to schools that are, how do we accept that as a society? So, but I think a lot of people agree with what I just said, and how we have to convince more people that a full-scale reform, and I don't just mean political reform, I mean a reform in the way that we deal with each other and the way we deal with the truth. And that is a spiritual project, in my opinion. And I don't mean a formally religious project. I mean, it's a project about our insides and what kind of human beings we want to be in the world. So that's a tough one.
Well, that was an excellent answer. And I knew the answer wouldn't be easy, but I think you mapped the territory very well. And I thank you for that. And Monica, just thank you so much for your work, because I think that the work of history is a fundamental part of this, telling the truth about history, that other people may try and distort then, but you just keep going back to it. And this was a missing chapter in history, and one that does, to me, when I first read about it, as I said, it just felt so resonant with a way in, a lens to apply to what's happening now that doesn't polarize people. It suggests that we all are having similar kinds of needs. We just find clarity and coherence in very, very strikingly different ways, some of which may be more dangerous than others. But I want to thank you for writing your book and doing the research that you've done. I'm so glad you requested that book about, are there witches here? Thank goodness you got it, and it's just been absolutely fascinating. Your work is literally illuminating and enlightening. And I thank you so much for that. And I thank you for taking time to come visit us on the morning show. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Mary. It was such an honor to have you in my guest bedroom here. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You take care now and keep thinking and keep writing.
I will. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you.
Keep surfacing those ghosts. So, all right. Well, now I'm going to welcome Joel Grossman is here, and he is the chaplain for Constellation Hospice right here in Newburyport. And he is going to tell us what these two words may not go together in your mind, death and cafe, but they do go together. And in fact, there's going to be a death cafe on Monday, March 1st. Joel, welcome to you. Thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show to talk to us. So Joel, please do tell us. Well, first of all, I don't know if everybody in Newburyport realizes that there is a hospice. Constellation Hospice is here. So maybe would you perhaps begin just by telling us a little bit about what Constellation Hospice is, where it is, and the kind of work you do for people in the greater Newburyport area?
Sure. Constellation Hospice started in Newburyport about 6 years ago. We're located, just our offices, at Country Center, which used to be called Country Manor on Low Street.
No, right for that is.
We serve all kinds of locations of people on hospice. So it could be at a nursing home, it could be at an assisted living, it could be in their home. Wherever they happen to be, we call that their home, and we serve them there. Yeah. And for people not so familiar with hospice, when I say serve, every hospice person and their family, we serve the family as well, is entitled to a nurse, a nurse's aide, a social worker, a chaplain, and a volunteer. The only one they have to use to be on hospice is the nurse. Everything else is optional. Yeah. And the other thing is that people tend to wait and wait and wait until the end to sign on to hospice. The earlier you sign on, the more benefit, help the patient and the family gets. And to qualify, a doctor, your doctor and the hospice doctor has to sign off that somebody has a 51% chance or better to die within 6 months. Yeah. We have people on hospice 2 years, 3 years. How does that happen? Well, as long as each review period, we can say, yeah, there's a greater than 50% chance of dying in 6 months, you're still on.
And then they can beat the odds until the next review. So yeah. Thank you for that. And I think that's an important message to underline then, that start early. And
we serve people from Maine to the South Shore in our office. Then Constellation is in Connecticut and Pennsylvania and other places. Okay. But so out of our office, Maine to the South Shore. So we're putting on a death cafe. We did 3 of them about 3 years ago at the Newburyport Public Library. And then COVID came around and we just decided we need to do this and we can do it virtually.
Well, tell us what happens at a death cafe. Who comes? What? Yeah.
A death cafe is simply a place to talk about death. To get it on the table, to not, say, well, we can't address that.
Yeah.
we're all mortal, and our loved ones are mortal, and it's something to face and deal with. So we start with about 10 minutes of everybody being together, explaining what this is about and how we're going to go about it. And then we break up into small groups, 6 to 8, maybe 10, depending on the whole group size, with a facilitator. And the facilitator is just there to help out if need be. You start with going around sharing, if you choose to, who you are and why you're there, what you're hoping to get the evening. And then it's open discussion. That goes on for an hour. And then we come back together and wrap up. Say, anybody want to say anything about what happened, have any questions? And that's it. There's no goals. There's no product. There's nothing to sell or promote. It's just, here's your chance to ask your questions, to share your feelings. And we get people from their 20s, looking at their parents' issue, what's going to happen, to people facing their own death, 90s, 100s. We had a person 100 come. And in between, like what might be and how do I feel about it.
Yeah.
So it's wide ranging.
Well, I was going to ask you what the age range was of people, and it's clearly just it's very broad. And
Very
if I'm
broad.
understanding you, Joel, that it's there's no set agenda, that aside from the topic being death or mortality, people can come and it's an opportunity to, it sounds to me like, not only ask your own questions, but to listen to the kinds of questions other people might be posing, and then engage in conversation. Whatever arises will arise. But there is a facilitator who, it sounds to me like, will just kind of help keep things going. And then they come back together as a group. So
one important point is that it's not a grief support group.
Okay.
People may address their grief, but if they would like to get more support, we'll have them meet in another breakout room with one other to talk together about that. Constellation has a monthly grief support group.
Okay.
So anybody who's interested in that, our number is 978-904-3059. Now, to get to attend the Death Cafe Monday night, 6 to 7:30, there's a Zoom link.
Okay.
And if they contact me, that's a way that I can send them the link. So should we put that in a chat, or how do we go about sharing that information?
Well, why don't you just go ahead and say what your email address is, Joel? Because it's fairly straightforward. I'm emailing you, and and then people can also, you might want to mention there was also an article in the Daily News about it. So if people get the Daily News, I think that the Zoom coordinates were at the end of that article, or they could look it up. So, but go ahead and
so if they just put Death Cafe into a Daily News search, it'll bring it up. Yeah.
And
but
your email
my
address?
email address is jgrossman@constellation, H as in health, S as in service.com. So jgrossman@constellationhs.com. We are doing this along with the Hospice Help Foundation, which is a wonderful organization based in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, but it serves the whole country, that gives money for people below the poverty line on hospice. So for funerals, for family visits, for access ramps to the house, to electricity, any financial need. It's applied for by a hospice social worker, any hospice. And then we declare, what we can give.
Wonderful. That also sounds like an enormously important resource for people to be aware of, Joel. So thanks for explaining that. Well, one final question, Joel, because we're running out of time for today. What do you think? I'm asking this just to see what it brings to your mind. what do you think might surprise people the most about attending a death cafe?
Laughter. We have a good time. Like any conversation about anything, there's high points, low points, confusions, understandings. It's a conversation.
In other words, the death cafe is full of life.
Yes, exactly. Well put. Oh, can I use it as a tagline?
Yes, you may.
Okay.
Joel, thank you so much for
Sure.
taking some time to visit the show and talk about this opportunity that people have. It's really great. Well, I think that's it. That's all we have time for today, everybody. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you'll join us next Thursday at 9 on Channel 9 for the morning show. My guests will be, I'll have representatives from the organization called Compassion and Choices that's advocating for the new end-of-life options bill to allow medical aid in dying in the state of Massachusetts. They'll be here, and I'll also have Camille Garrow and others who have been working hard to plan a very exciting program for this year's Women's History Month in March. So if you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show. Go to ncmhub.org and click on the YouTube icon. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. and then again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. and will also be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just once again, go to www.ncmhub.org, click on the cloud icon, and then scroll down. See you next Thursday at 9 on Channel 9, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye, Joel.
Bye. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.